And now let's go directly into the discussion. In order to enlighten our discussions today and to set the scene again, we have Donatella, who kindly accepted to work together with Lorenzo on a discussion paper that we shared with you already. I hope that many of you had the chance at least to look at it. Donatella will take the time today to walk us through it, and it is very important because I think it will contribute to give a little bit of hope and optimism, and to help us also look with positive eyes on the impact of our action in difficult times like we are living today, when sometimes it's hard to see beyond the daily struggles and to learn from failures and to see them in a more long-term perspective and to look better at our victories. So Donatella, please, the floor is yours, and afterwards we will continue with our panelists.
Thank you very much. And in fact, when we were discussing about what we could focus our meeting upon, we thought it was good to try to bring some optimism by focusing on some successful case of involvement of civil society and social movements in, was the title, of these encounters in being able to capturing the winds of change. But I want to start with a disclaimer. So I never felt like either an organic or a not organic intellectual, and I don't think that sociologists can indicate the way. So even though I wrote a book on how social movements can save democracy, my intention is not to give recipe. And part of the discussion paper also focuses on the reasons why it is so difficult to single out the right strategies to capturing the wind of change. I think it is useful to list some of these challenges when reflecting on strategic choices that movements and civil society organizations always have to make, not in order to find the right solutions, as I mentioned, but rather to single out some important point in these decisions. So even if I wrote this book, I think that it is difficult to single out the successful strategies for any type of struggles, but it is important to reflect upon, under specific circumstances, what happened in other cases. And one of the reasons why it is difficult to single out the right strategies is that movements, each type of campaigns, opinion campaigns and so on, is made of many organizations that have different strategic routes. This was also one of the lessons that came from the European Social Forum, that movements are very diverse and that it is good that movements are so diverse. In fact, in social movement studies, there have been a debate about which is better, thinking big or thinking small. But eventually the answer was that different types of campaigns, different types of struggles have different components within them, and that what helps is not choosing one of these paths, but being able to create structures and practices that are able to combine differences in a not disruptive way. And this is easy to say, but more difficult to do, because this implies addressing challenges of coalitions that are there because different organizations represent also different traditions, different skills, different ways of thinking. But I think that's not only the forums of the global justice movement, but also the camps of the anti-austerity protest and the different forms that have been singled out also in the hot autumn of 2019 and during the pandemic exactly aim at the creations of this type of spaces. So not one strategist, but the capacity and the perseverance in trying to find this space of dialogue. Another issue that is important when assessing successes and failures is that any mobilizations, and all the more so successful mobilizations, produce reactions, produce counter-movements, and produce institutional reactions. Not often of the brutal type that Raffaella described yesterday about the Genova Social Forum, but I think the illusion to avoid is that civil society organizations and social movements alike can produce consensus among institutions and in the populations at large. It is a conflictual field that social movements and other groups address, and so victories produce also backlash. But I think what we don't have to conceive the backlash of, because empirical evidence tells us so, is the fact that progressive movements get backlash when they go too far. I don't think this is the case. I think often the backlash is produced by the fact that achievements are not consolidated and that the society and politics did not get far enough. To give an example, anti-gender type of movements are not produced by excessive demands by on feminism and gender rights, but rather by the fact that conflictual fields always produce counter-reactions. So here, I think the challenge is at the same time to recognize the complex fields in which you can and want produce consensus among groups and actors that are compatible. So consensual debate on how to make democracy high quality in terms of communication arenas and so on is important, but it is important also to delimitate the range of actors that could take part in a consensual process. And at the same time, to leave other type of strategies open to interact with other actors with which bargaining is necessary, but consensus building much more difficult. Then another issue that is to consider that makes the singling out of a good recipe difficult, but I think helps the reflections when different type of progressive actors try to single out the right things to do in a specific moment and in a specific struggle. It's something that also Raffaella singled out yesterday, and it is the issues of time. There is obvious tendencies in social movements to create identities that also, collective identities, that also help postponing gratification. So research on the labor movement single out the relevance of struggles, coalitions, unions, and so on, in creating common identities that could be negotiated in the long-term perspective with these ideas, but also empirical observations that one of the products of social movements is the collective identities, which means overcoming the selfishness of each individual. But I think there is also a trade-off, because social movements have also, and civil society organizations alike, have also to achieve gratifications now. So one of the important elements when looking at how wave or cycles of protest works is that suddenly, as it has been studied also for waves of strikes, in some moment, the mobilizations intensifies, and gratification, so the impressions of having successful outcomes in terms of numbers of people in the street, in terms of recognitions that Lorenzo, a term that Lorenzo used earlier on, is also very important in order to convince ourselves and others that it is worth struggling. So that's those type of strategies, going into the street, or opinion campaigns, educational strategies, and so on, that they are to a certain extent effective. So I think this is another trade-off that is important to point at. Only postponement is not satisfactory, not only because problems are urgent, but also because people need to be convinced that the path is the right one. And so having some success, even if it is not the success that is measured on the basis of the broad aims of social movements, is important. At the same time, I mentioned time perspective because it is also untenable when looking at empirical evidence, a vision of a progressive path that is not interrupted in different moments by different type of trends. Movements goes in cycles because the intensity of participations is something that is difficult to keep in balance with the everyday life of activists that are not professionals. And also there have been a lot of research in social movement studies about how cycles develop, why suddenly mobilizations expand, often in an unexpected way. Think about the World Social Forums, but also 2011 with the austerity process. But at the same time, the idea that progress is going in an univocal trend proved unfortunately untenable. The Time says that civil society, progressive forces in general, goes through bumpy ways, and an important way to address the challenge is also to be able to reflect on how to facilitate mobilizations, but also how movements survive in times of low ebb. And here I think that's also the encounter today is particularly important because it helps also in an assessment of the achievements of progressive movements that should, I think, be more balanced, that we tend to have it. Alessandro Pizzorno, an Italian sociologist who studied a lot the labor movement, warned us about our tendency, and I'm talking also our tendency as scholars, as students of social movements, to declare that a revolution is arriving each time there is an intensification of struggles, but also to assess that the movement failed when mobilizations decline. So I think that this way of considering time is also important in order to reflect on which are the residuals, what is resilient of each struggles, and also how to assess effects of movements, not only on institutions, but also on themselves. And here I'm thinking also about historical work on the labor movements that supported Rosa Luxemburg analysis of the general strikes as something that was important not so much or not only in terms of immediate policy results or procedural results, finding channels to enter into institutions, but also in creating residuals of identities of organization as well, because there is the ideas that social movements and moment of cycles of process disrupt organizational structures. This is to a certain extent true when we think about established organizations. Is each cycle of labor struggles has challenged also the trade unions of the time. But these cycles also are producing organizations, and probably also this European Civic Forum and Academy is something that could be considered as residuals, as an outcome of the protest. And so usually when we address and try to measure the effects and outcomes of social movements and civil society organizations, we try to face all these challenges also by looking empirically at how movements have been able to change policies. So how they were able to have an impact, and this is, as I mentioned, something that is constantly challenged. Think about the abortion laws that seemed a given achievement and that are challenged now, but also the importance of the creations of channels of access to institutions. And I think that while there is, of course, also difficulties of social movement and civil societies to find institutional interlocutors in a moment in which center-left parties went more to the center, in a moment in which even social movements, organizations are attacked, and civil society organizations are attacked and criminalized, not only from the far right. I think it is important also to consider procedural achievements that have been made in the past, the recognitions of new arenas of participations. And what I look at in this book is also social movements and civil society organizations crossing the borders between civil society and political institutions. The water referendum that was mentioned for the Italian case as an important moment in 2011, but also a residual of the European Social Forum, is an example of the fact that civil society has not renounced or given up the use of institutional channels. And the water referendum is just an example. So if you consider changes in Ireland in recent years in a progressive directions, from abortion law to same-sex marriage, this would have not been possible without the referendums that were promoted from below. And 5 minutes left. What I think is important also to consider, and this is an issues that is going to be discussed in the plenaries as well as in the various sessions, is that social movements also enter institutions, and civil society also find new channels of access within institutions because party system changes. On the one hand, we have a trend in the political party system towards a mainstreaming of some traditional parties that represented previous cleavages in the societies. But I think we should also see how struggles like the ones of the European Social Forum, the anti-austerity protest, mobilizations during the pandemics, have also produced innovations even at the level of the party system through more sensitivity of more orthodox left-wing parties to mobilizations from below, and this is something that we can see in the struggles within Labour Party in the UK or the Democratic Party in the United States, but also transformations in parties that seems more stable to a certain extent, like the SPD, that is facing also a request to change. But especially what I think is important is to look at cases of success of new type of parties and parties that are not the, I can say, representatives of social movements, but that are sensitive to claims within social movements, and these include national parties from Greece to Spain to Chile to Colombia and other cases that to a certain extent surprised us with the capacity to change, but also at the local level. And in Eastern Europe, some examples of parties that developed from movements at the local level represented also a way to go beyond the sort of post-socialist syndrome that singled out the weakness of civil society and instead pointing at the importance of politizations in this type of process. And that I can stop just by, because I see you are getting nervous now. 2 minutes. Also by saying that what I find very daring, but also very important in these complex strategies that are not, should not be mutually exclusive, is that more and more social movements and civil society organizations of the progressive side have taken a constitutional pathway seriously, so they have not limited themselves in claiming policy changes, but the example of Iceland was one of the first, not totally successful, but very interesting in pointing at the importance in intense times, in times of crisis and so on, to also address the fundamental basis of the interactions between civil society and political institutions. The constitutional process in Latin America has been quite fundamental for several countries, and Chile is one of them. Of course, also these constitutional processes see moment of success and moment of failure, but faced to a visions of social movements and civil society as single issues and secluded into a space which is outside, at the gate of the institutions, I think it is important to learn also from these processes in which instead civil society organizations and social movements have there trying to change the very rules. And they've done so because the financial crisis first, the climate change crisis then, the health crisis connected with the pandemics pointed at the importance to go back to the roots of democracies. Thank you very much.